In today's video, I'm demonstrating various techniques for rescuing poorly recorded drums. Be sure to hit that like button and consider subscribing for future content. Remember to turn on all notifications. Let's get into it. So this past week in the SPL Mixing Music Community Facebook group, that's a mouthful, we ran a mini mixing challenge. So there were 8 microphones and the group had to use all of what they were given, except no samples were allowed to be used. We got some pretty good mixes out of it. I also took part and I'll show you what I came up with and what I was able to extract from these poorly recorded drums. So what we have here are 8 drum mics, all recorded in a home studio using less than ideal microphones. And this is actually a drum test recording, not the final drums for a song, so there are no musical files to go with this. The goal then with this is just to get them in a place where they could be adapted further to a song without changing them too much. Now, when I first heard these drums, I imagined the drums in a Queens of Stone Age type of song. So I went for a fairly aggressive and punchy clean sound. I've added a rhythmic delay to add some interest. If I was mixing this into a song, the delay would be automated for different sections. It's not something that I would leave on for the entire mix. So prevention is always going to be better than the cure. Let's have a look at some of the raw files and some of the challenges that could have been addressed at the recording stage but weren't. Generally speaking, the drums were clipped slightly during the recording process, which no doubt added some digital harshness. It wasn't so bad that I needed to use any declipper modules from iZotope RX. The remedy here was just some EQ and playing with the overall balances. The room that the drums were recorded in sounds quite small. If you're going for a big drum sound, which it sounds like they were, then hire a church or a hall for the day. The remedy for that is EQ, delay and reverb to try and remove the things that make it sound small, and then reinvent the recording space using effects. And I'll show you how I did that. The room also sounds untreated, and so the use of a room mic here just seemed like a waste. If we have a listen to that, the room's not very good. It was a bit of a waste capturing a bad sounding room that doesn't really add anything worthwhile to the mix. So the remedy is either EQ, which could mean a lot of EQ in this case, or turn the room mic into something else entirely different. And I'll show you exactly what I did with that. Now, the cymbals sound like they're quite shiny, which in my experience always leads to balancing issues because of their inherent harshness. When you've got crossbleed between the different instruments, which we'll talk about in a second, that always leads to balancing issues because you've got that harshness across a bunch of different mics. I recommend never shining your cymbals and just letting them accrue dirt. So the remedy for that in the mixing stage is just EQ and some dynamic EQ. And as I spoke about before, there's an excess amount of crossbleed between some of the microphones, which could have been prevented through using better microphones that have stronger rear and side rejection of sounds, and that would make the microphone placements less critical. Obviously, if the microphones are cheap, placement is more critical than ever, and a lot of that crossbleed or spill between those mics could have been minimized. The remedy here is just some manual editing, balancing, EQ, sidechaining, and gating. And we haven't even got to the point where the drums are actually usable. We're just trying to fix stuff at this point. A lot of stuff to fix. If we have a listen to the kick drum, it's pretty bad. I'm not sure what they did. It's almost like there's an initial click and then there's like a repeat click. So I don't know if something was loose or what the deal was there, but it sounds pretty bad. If we have a listen to the snare top, got a lot of hi-hat bleed in that. And I found when I processed these drums, I was reaching for a particular sound, and the more I reached for that sound, the more problems it actually brought up to the forefront. For example, all of the cymbals that were happening at various points throughout the mix were just bleeding into those microphones. And that's the issue with cheaper microphones. Let's go to the snare bottom. There's some kick bleed in there, but there's also, I can hear cymbals in there as well. That's quite unusual for a snare bottom mic. I don't think it's highly unusual to hear the kick drum because of the proximity of the kick to the actual bottom of the snares. Typically what I would do is I would gate it fairly tightly and you wouldn't hear all of the rattle that's happening in between. But, you know, as far as fine-tuning the recording process, they could have done a myriad of things to stop that from happening. They could put tissue paper at each end, anything just to stop that continual rattling while other things are going on. It's quite bad through this particular section. That's the tom-tom, and that's just setting off the snare. If you're unfamiliar, is the wires that belong on the bottom of that drum. So there's not a lot you could do apart from tightly gate that. Let's look at the tom. I think the actual tom-tom hit doesn't come until here, and then might be one or two later. It shouldn't look like this though. The hit should be miles above the level of all the bleed. This is the bleed. If we compare it to what I ended up with, quite a big difference there. What else? The floor tom, using this as a way to judge it, you can see that the level of the bleed is considerably lower than the hit itself, which is not the case on this track. So it's not too bad. But you can hear that there's snare bleed in there. Again, that could be mic placement, but with cheap mics, it's really difficult. The other things to mention here, apart from the fact that the overheads are stereo for what are essentially mono mics, the names of the tracks are just too long and they don't actually correlate to anything. I had to listen to each of them individually just to figure out what they were. So what are some of the things that I did? Gee whiz, there was so much to do in this session. Let's start at the top. So the mix bus, just a bit of limiting at the very end. And then there was a little bit of corrective EQ just to get everything sounding the way that I wanted it to sound. This is fairly heavily compressed, but you'll notice that the wet dry is turned down. If we turn it up, you can have a listen. So what's that, 63%? I just love the amount of energy that adds, and obviously 100 was too much. As far as techniques, let's have a look at the kick. Wow, I mean that's some serious EQ that's happening on there. Quite a big boost happening there. I suppose the thing to note here is that all of the stuff happening in the top, you can hear that really high click sound. That's all gone. And then I've added some transient designer just to get some more oomph out of it, because in its raw state, I guess it didn't have enough. Then I've put even more transient designer on it. Looks like I ditched the gate. We can get rid of that. Some more EQ, and I'm using the compression. Let's have a listen up to that point. Okay, now this is interesting. You'll see this on a few other examples. So what's going on here is, let me just bypass it. Have a listen to the length of the note. If you're on headphones, it may not be as clear, but what I'm doing here is I'm using a very fine Q. So a fine Q is when you get the thinnest out of the parametric, and when you do that you get a bit of filter ringing and you also get a boost at that frequency. and then it's getting sent to this snare verb, which it's only getting sent a tiny amount. Let's turn that off. It was so dry and upfront that it just needed something. And what's on here? So I've got Kramer Pie, I've got a little bit of little plate, some harmonic distortion, some delays, quite a bit of compression. Not on the kick though, it's doing a lot more on the snare. And then a gate to control the length of that. We've got this being sent to bus 1. This looks like a copy of the snare also being sent to bus 1. Okay, so that'll just be to crush the overheads so that they're not allowing some of that bleed from the kick and the snare to come through. Let's keep on moving. Next, we've got a lot of EQ again. We've got compression, quite a lot. I've absolutely cranked the output. And then I've got this gate, which is great because it's actually a multi-band gate. So if I take this off, so it really does get rid of that tom-tom and any other kind of low mid, low frequency build-up that's happening in the mix. Just clears that out of the snare drum. It's great. And then probably should move that up. The snare bottom is phase inverted, and then I've got a gate on that. Doesn't completely shut the gate. It's letting through a little bit of the bleed. Just some EQ. Looks like I've added some bands here in addition to the Smart band from Smart EQ3. And then what else? So this is more corrective stuff in the context of the mix. So just getting the snare to sit there. Some compression. Looks like I'm clipping that. Then I've got a gate. Then I've actually got a little bit of a Bricacity M7 Deep Stone preset, and it's running at 3%. And if I take it off, it sounds like this. So it's just adding a little bit of something, and then I've got some saturation, harmonic distortion, a little bit of a top end boost. So you can see that I'm quite brutal on the individual mics, and then when it comes to EQ as a group, I pretty much got everything where I want it to be. This EQ here, you could reasonably argue, hey, why didn't you use that boost in this EQ? Because, well, I wasn't hearing it at that point. I was hearing that I needed something in the context of the mix when I was listening, but by the time I got through all this stage, I was lacking a bit of top end. That's what I ended up doing at that point. It's okay to do that because you're hearing it differently at different points during the whole assembly process of getting those drums together. I think I spent about an hour on this, and then I spent several hours more on the other aspects of it, which I'll get into. Obviously, we're sending a little bit to that snare reverb. The tom-toms. So the tom-toms we had, I've actually cut them out. Interesting to note on the tom-toms is in their raw state, they didn't really have a lot going for them. So let me just... So this is actually taking signal from the bus, from bus 1, which as we know had the snare top duplicate and the kick being sent to it. And that's just to make sure that, I think it was to get rid of some of the spill, and for whatever reason I've left that on there. So what that would have done is that would have crushed any snare or kick hits that were happening. And that's after the kick and the snare are gated. They become really useful triggers because they're so tightly gated after that point, and you can send them anywhere and use them to crush other parts of the mix. Not surprising here that I've got more EQ on that, which is the Smart band, and lots of little adjustments here and there just to try and get rid of resonances and things I didn't like. Sometimes to get extreme results, you've got to use extreme settings. So that did a really good job of getting rid of some of the slap and extending some of the note, but that wasn't enough. And I believe what you'll see here is that same trick again with the fine Q, and that's just to get the length of the note. I've also added a bit more attack. Also, I should note this is a little bit like a smiley face because I'm adding a bit of low end at the fundamental frequency and I'm extending the length of that. At the same time, you've got to try and get the top end balanced with that. So that's what I'm doing there. Same probably goes for this one. So a lot of EQ at the top and the bottom, a bit of a smiley face happening. And then I've got similar sort of thing, but I wanted less of the mid-range. Here's how that sounded in its raw state. Sounds great already. Then we get to, let me accentuate that for you actually. So that's 2.1 dB. So that's a trick I sometimes use when something is just lacking tone and I want to bring out more of the fundamental frequency. Now that's getting sent to bus 2. So let's have a look at where bus 2 is going. So this is actually getting sent to the overheads, set up as a sidechain to crush the overheads every time that tom-tom is heard. So if we play that without it, so it just gives it a little bit more of a forward sound. So it's stopping it from getting into the overheads and then it's releasing that compression pretty quickly so that what you hear is what was going into the overheads. That just helps with imaging sometimes, I find. So that's the tom-toms. The tom-toms are actually going into this and yeah, just a little bit of compression. It's unlinked, link settings left and right, but they act independently. Without that, sounds great. Then we've got our two overheads. I didn't do anything at all. I basically treated these two as one sound because they get bussed to this aux and then looks like I've got some low end gating. So let's turn all of these off. Let's turn this off. So it's really cleaning up that low end. Then I've got some compression and then I've got some EQ, lots of different EQ moves going on there. Then it's actually going into a bit of this deep stone again, which we saw on the snare master. It looks like I changed the length, slightly different settings there. So I've chopped off the start of that impulse response. There's one on the snare starts here, and this is the full one for the overheads. So they still exist in the same space, but they've just got a longer one on the overheads. So it just gives it a bit more of a bigger room sound. Then we've got our kick and snare, just crushing them. Pretty much the snare is what's driving that. And then we've got some dynamic EQ here. So that'll be contextual EQ. I would have decided this by listening in context. So what I was doing there is using these two bands. So I wanted some brightness, but I didn't want the brightness when the cymbals were harsh. So it's kind of acting against that so that every time a harsh cymbal hits, it adjusts the level of the brightness that's coming out of that. Still sounds a bit trashy, but I think in the context that still works. The room is pretty interesting. And by interesting, I mean insane. But the start of the song just needed something to make it a bit more rhythmically interesting. Here it is without the EQ. Lower frequencies rolled off and just basically corrected by ear to sound the way that I wanted it to sound. So that was obviously some sort of room sound that I didn't like. You You can really hear the boxiness in that. If I boost that, you can hear there that a lot of that small room sound just disappears by pulling that out. And this, I would say, would be harshness. And then we've got some multi-band gating happening. Cleans it up so beautifully. And then we've got Echosphere. Just a little bit of ambience, and then this is where I think things start to get a little bit crazy. You can hear how they're giving the track a bit of a call and response thing, which is highly appropriate for that section. Then I just decided to put some flanger on there. Just why not? So my goal really with the room track was just to turn it into something that could be used, and also just make it quite different to what was already there. The more different you can make it, the more it becomes more of an effect rather than a room track. As it is, you get those multi-tap type delays that are happening. It just helps create an atmosphere. That's all I'm doing with that. What else did we want to look at? So you can see here there is extensive editing on the kick and the snare. The kick, as a matter of fact, you wouldn't have maybe seen this before, but I've just chopped it so tightly so that it's basically manually gated. That kick is so short. It's just giving me that part of the kick that I want to hear, and then I'm getting more of the attack from the multi-band and the single band transient designers. But what had to happen in order for me to be able to process this was to just, did I keep another playlist? I don't think I did. If you have a listen to this where I haven't processed the drums, let me just reveal. Let me pick, say, this section. Now, because I've added so much processing, what I ended up with in the end was the snare track had so much bleed from all these different instruments that were happening around it, the tom-toms, the cymbals, even the kick drum, and it was just screwing up the overall image of the drums. And so the only way to really get around that is to get the snare drum sound that I wanted. I needed to edit in between the hits. Here's how it sounded unedited. As opposed to so essentially what that is it's just a bit of manual gating using clip gain. So I did that quite different for different parts based on the energy of the song. And man, it took quite a few hours just to fine tune that and get the level of bleed that felt right. So just as a reminder, this is where we started. And here's where we finished. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you like what I've done? Do you have any other ways that you might have processed this? By the way, if you want to go and check these out, you can head over to the Facebook group, and voting is still open at this point in time, and you can vote on a winner. I look forward to seeing you over there, and if you ever need anything mixed, Daniel@splmixing.com. Thank you for watching, and happy mixing.